Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mildra, and I'm your gaming monk. May 17th, 2021, 8 p.m. Central Time. I hit the record button for what was, at that time, in my mindset, a podcast episode like any other. The title was Class Warfare, creating a track-based class system. The idea with it being taking the track system that's in Legend and applying it to Final Fantasy jobs. This was the 39th episode of the Geek Watch podcast, and unfortunately it had to be split into two parts due to a power outage mid-stream. At the time, this was just like any other podcast I had done over the past few years. Unfortunately, its status as just another episode, quote-unquote, did not last. In fact, it only lasted a week. They say the most stubborn thing in the world is an idea. I can speak from personal experience to the truth of that statement. It was from that one podcast episode, just one on my schedule that week, that planted the seed that would become what we see now, Final Fantasy TRPG Legend Edition. At the time of this recording, it has been 5 years since the project started. People have enrolled in college and graduated in the time it took me to make this. I have made many projects that appeared for a while and then were lost to limbo, as any creative has. And yet, this is one that's in a complete state. This is one that's not in the realm of potential greatness or hypothetical championships. No, this is one that is real, and a realness that will always be present in some form. So I suppose in these moments of introspection, I find myself asking, why? Why of all the projects that I've developed over the years, is this the one that's the most complete? Why is that? It's a question that has many answers, but if I were to attempt to answer them, I think the idea of what Legend Edition was an idea that embedded itself in me so deeply that it didn't allow for any other possibility but for it to be made. Many people have ideas, but those ideas are crushed under the weight of putting pen to paper, or are sanded down by outside influence to the point where it represents a committee more than an artist, or are talked out of them by outside forces telling them that the idea can't work. And yet, this one isn't. Now, in this video, I'd like to explore why that is. Something I've noticed from talking with hundreds of developers over the years is that a lot of people start their design journey after playing 1 or 2 games over multiple sessions and then wanting to do a certain spin on it. That was never me. I played and read a lot of games over the years, even more so when I had access to reliable internet and I could see what other independent developers and fans were doing. This meant that ultimately I would develop a wider body of knowledge from just constantly reading and studying, and moreover a wider understanding of what's consistently worked and what hasn't by what I see repeatedly in games and what, well, I don't. It's said that unless you're abnormally gifted, the best way to learn a craft thoroughly is to learn not only its central tenets but its pitfalls, to quote the Amazon description of the book, Web Pages That Suck. While having a wider pool of knowledge has created a degree of separation from others in my spaces, it has also laid the foundation for my approach. Look at what's out there, see how other people tackled the idea, study what works and what doesn't. A minor aside, but when I learned that Harv Bennett, I looked at it and I said, that's the bare minimum expected of me. I've since learned that this mindset was not the standard, but it was a foundational piece nonetheless. Now, speaking of pitfalls, as I mentioned a moment ago, let's talk about fan-made TTRPGs. I've seen quite a few fan games of various IP, and have found that there are more people who have an idea of doing a game than actually see it through. That's not to discount some of the great work that some people have done, and some of those works I hope to highlight in the future. Now, some get lucky and make a vertical slice, and that's it. However, others end up draining their momentum through endless playtesting that creates a tightening loop. When I first began writing and coalescing the idea of Legend Edition, the pillars that are in Chapter 1 were first priority, but also the groundwork for a message. This is not something that is meant to be in perpetual development. This has a start point, a development path, and an end point. This is not a live service. It is not a search for a perfect iteration. Even when the scope expanded, that was never going to change. At some point, there was going to be a closed door, a statement of good enough, and leave a window open for home brewing by others in the future. That was the energy I saw from some of my favorite fan-made games, and I wanted to emulate that rather than speak on 10 plus years of development with a game that's ultimately still in beta. That singular-minded direction is what made things appealing for others to follow along, I think. That was how a team of sorts formed from the project, instead of just being a two-person job. However, it also led to a certain entitlement of a sort. You see, many times in organizations, an idea is pitched in one way, and comes out the other end with the corners sanded off. A death by 1,000 cuts turns the work of a singular artist into the work of a collective, via people wanting to give their input or their take, in some cases just to feel like they're a part of the process. Since the time of the initial presentation at Sage about 2 years ago, there was a lot of feedback I learned from, but the biggest part was discerning what feedback was worth listening to and what wasn't. While Final Fantasy is many things to many people, Legend Edition was singularly focused on being a single thing that drew from commonalities. It was not interested in overly representing one thing or one aspect. I think that the critiques that I deemed not worth listening to were the ones that were born out of the expectation of one thing, the desire to force it into a familiar shape, or an assumption built upon surface-level elements. In all of those cases, there was a recurring pattern so consistent that it would mirror the villains of the series the game is based on, an inability to see the greater picture. On the other hand, the criticism I did take was from people who understood the idea that was trying to get out and had suggestions to refine it. Ultimately, it takes a certain constitution to maintain that direction, and inevitably the time will come when that conviction is tested. The one moment where the measuring stick, those who follow will be less inclined to be present at that table when the outcome isn't safe, when the answer isn't one that can be revised later on. Two people only had the stomach to keep going when swimming in the gentle softness of a group, and so they let that group speak for them as they sank into the pool. Their words no longer their own, their actions subject to approval, their eyes needing permission to see. Sometimes they'll shout from a distance, voice their indignation as if they were leading the charge instead of following the leader. However, all they did was switched leaders that they followed to one less committed to a goal, and instead embraced an endless idea of a goal. So long as they sink into that pool of muffled cotton, their voice will never reach beyond that group. A small group, one whose names can do nothing but rust away at the bottom of the sea. However, even with those obstacles, new opportunities arose. In that, what was supposed to be a collection of Google Docs turned into something far more than that, with alternate rules, a whole wiki, and exactly what it was meant to be. A foundation bucket of Legos to build things in a direction that anyone could potentially want to go in. The funny thing is, I've been transparent about everything from the start. 12 years ago, I created the Monastery to fill a need I felt no one else was filling in the tabletop space. 7 years ago, I started interviewing game devs because I wanted to give them a place to talk about their work when few others would. 5 years ago, I started writing Legend Edition to fill a need I felt was unfulfilled in the space when it came to Final Fantasy fan games. There's a recurring pattern of, if no one else will do it, I'll do it myself. And so I did. I never asked for status, and yet I gained some measure of it. I never viewed myself as a journalist, and yet I somehow became one. I never saw myself leading a development team, and yet I did. I suppose the fact that I didn't go out looking for these things meant I was the ideal personality to have it. So now, with Legend Edition having been developed for 5 years and publicly released for 2 years, let's pull things back to that earlier question, why? My answer is that Legend Edition is the ultimate expression of something I've wanted to do for over 2 decades now. When most put up walls between the worlds of tabletop and other newer media, such as video games, anime and manga, and so on, I wanted to be a particular bridge across that gap and show that the world of tabletop need not be where angels fear to tread, as is the unfortunate reputation it has due to some people's aversion to math. That take, the idea of drawing inspiration from video games for TTRPG projects, put me on the fringe at the time. In some circles, it made me a folk devil, where it was rewarding to isolate me from the group. However, this only hardened my resolve, especially since, in all the vitriol, no one could give me a strong enough reason not to do it. So I persisted, and I feel I was eventually validated, especially given the state of the independent scene nowadays. In light of that, Legend Edition is something that could only be spearheaded to completion by someone like me. Someone who didn't have a group to answer to. Someone who created culture instead of adhering to it. Someone who was less concerned with whether a decision would maintain standing in a group and more with an adherence to a personal moray. I don't say all this out of arrogance, but merely out of reflection and contrast. So now, here we are. 5 years of weekly design sessions and stressful discourse. Where do we go from here? The answer is not only obvious, but it's been clearly stated multiple times. Where we go is through the path of the crusade that I've set myself upon for the past 12 years. But before I go, I'd like to thank a few people who have been along the journey with me. First and foremost, the late Brian Fitzpatrick, who first saw design potential in me even when I didn't. Xanatrix Zidare, my co-writer, editor-in-chief, and eternal stalwart. Jeremy Jack, one of the most long-standing supporters of this crusade and the man whose design you're seeing right now. RC Chris, another vocal flag bearer for the crusade I've put myself on, and a fellow designer and person who's intent on creating a creative culture. John Tegg, formerly known as the Shades, who took a chance on me as a GM all those years ago, and we've been in each other's consistent presence ever since. Sigmunder Orlando, who I've come to see as a valued brother in my monastery. And Mistress Riona, whose contributions to keeping me centered in some of the toughest parts of the last 5 years, completely without measure. And also the hundreds, if not thousands of folk who've taken a chance on me in this crusade of mine, gambling on an unproven monk who spent years downplaying his capacity. Thank you. I hope that I can continue earning the respect that you all have given me. And to you, dear viewer, I hope you will continue to accompany me for both Legend Edition and the greater crusade that it was born from. I may be only one monk, but I like to think I'm one with a clear path laid out before me. So, walk with me, and let's see what tomorrow brings us. Stay frosty, everyone.